The park that afternoon felt like a world suspended between seasons. The last hints of spring clung to the air, but summer was pressing in with a quiet persistence, bringing with it a warmth that softened even the hardest concrete edges. The trees lining the long gravel path were lush and heavy with leaves, their branches stretching like tired arms after a long sleep. Beneath them, the light played a game of shadow and sun, flickering across the benches and scattering patterns on the pavement. Children squealed with delight near the fountain at the center, their laughter ringing out like silver bells over the steady hum of city life. Somewhere, a cyclist's bell chimed, sharp and quick, then faded into the distance. Near the eastern edge of the park, past the row of flowering hedges that shielded the path from the street, sat a man who seemed almost removed from the life around him. He occupied one of the older benches, its green paint peeling in strips, the wood beneath scarred by years of weather and the occasional careless carving. A paper cup of coffee rested between his hands. Its rim was damp where his lips had touched it, though the liquid inside had long since cooled. He wore a plain black jacket with frayed cuffs and a faint threadbare patch near the collar. His jeans were faded, his boots scuffed and marked by miles of use, and his hair hung loose over his forehead, shifting only when the wind reached down to brush it aside. It was not unusual for someone to sit alone in this park, to take a breath away from the spinning gears of city life, but there was something about this man's stillness that set him apart. He was not resting between errands or tapping away at a phone like so many others. He was still in a way that suggested an inner world vast and occupied. His shoulders curved gently forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and though his eyes were open, they seemed fixed on something far beyond the trees and fountains. There was a weight about him, not the heavy, drooping weight of despair, but the quiet gravity of reflection. A mother pushing a stroller slowed as she approached. Her child, a little boy with curls peeking out from under a blue cap, pointed at the man on the bench and whispered something. The mother followed the gesture, her eyes scanning the man's face, and for a moment recognition flickered. She offered a polite smile, but he did not notice. His gaze was elsewhere, his hands loosely clasped around that cup. The mother moved on, though she glanced back once or twice as she disappeared around the curve of the path. Farther down, two teenagers on skateboards paused to adjust their wheels. One looked up, squinting toward the bench. "Hey," he murmured, nudging his friend. "Doesn't that guy look like?" His friend followed the line of sight, eyes narrowing. "No way," he whispered back. They both stood still for a few seconds, caught in the strange awe of recognizing someone out of context. Fame belongs on screens, on stages, not on old benches under tired trees. But here he was, and the ordinariness of the setting only made him more extraordinary. They were not the only ones who noticed. A woman walking her dog stopped just long enough to look twice. A jogger slowed her pace, pulling out one earbud, unsure why something about that man felt significant. The world seemed to sense, in some subtle way, that this was not just any man lost in thought. This was Keanu Reeves, an actor known for playing heroes and wanderers, a man whose name carried weight not just for his films but for the quiet stories whispered about his kindness. A tourist, standing a short distance away, raised a phone hesitantly. She hesitated, lowered it, then raised it again. She was not sure why she wanted the picture, only that something about the scene felt important, like catching a comet in the corner of your eye. She snapped the shot. The shutter sound was masked by the laughter of children, the hum of a passing bus, the rustle of leaves. Keanu did not move. He remained still, elbows on knees, coffee between his fingers, eyes distant. Within minutes, the photo traveled from her phone to a social media post, and from there it leapt like wildfire across the digital world. Captions bloomed in every corner of the internet. "Sad Keanu." Memes appeared within hours, each one trying to outdo the last with cleverness or absurdity. Some placed speech bubbles over his head with outlandish thoughts. Others added dramatic filters, imagining tragic backstories or secret missions. A few turned it into motivational posters, writing in bold letters, Even heroes rest sometimes. Television hosts laughed about it on late-night shows, tossing out jokes while audiences chuckled. Articles appeared with titles like "Why is Keanu Reeves so sad?" and "The mystery behind the park bench photo." It became a trend, a conversation piece, a shared joke. But somewhere among the noise, a few voices emerged with softer tones. Comments began to surface. "He has been through so much. Let him have his peace. This man lost his best friend, his child, and his partner, yet he still gives to others. Show respect." But those voices were few. The majority were content to keep scrolling, to keep laughing, to treat the image as nothing more than fodder for amusement. What they could not see, what the photo could not capture, was the reality of that moment. The texture of the bench beneath him, the cool weight of the coffee cup in his hands, the memories turning over quietly in his mind like stones smoothed by a river. Keanu sat there for a long time, unmoved by the flurry of life around him. A sparrow hopped close to his boots, tilting its head as though studying him, then fluttered away. The fountain kept its steady rhythm, splashing over smooth stones, catching the light whenever the clouds broke apart. The world moved on, unaware that it was being watched by a man who carried layers of stories far deeper than any meme could tell. After what felt like an hour, he finally stirred. He raised the cup to his lips, taking a small sip, though the coffee had gone bitter and lukewarm. He sighed quietly, not out of irritation or exhaustion, but in that way someone does when they are carrying thoughts too big to hold in. Rising slowly, he stretched his back and tucked the notepad in his pocket deeper, as if making sure it would not fall. He walked toward the trash bin, dropped the empty cup in, and began to stroll down the path, blending into the crowd of ordinary lives. Those who passed him now might have noticed, or they might not have. He did not seek recognition. He never had. To him, this was just another day, another moment, another chance to feel the world without pretense. That photograph, the one that would ripple across the globe, was just a fragment of a much larger truth. It was not sadness the world had glimpsed. It was humanity, pure and unguarded. And soon, as more pieces of his story emerged, the internet would learn that the man on the bench was not someone to laugh at, but someone to learn from. Long before that park bench moment, long before the world's memes and headlines, Keanu Reeves had been living with layers of grief hidden behind a gentle smile. To understand what sat on his shoulders that day, you have to step back and see the story that shaped him. One that began not on a movie set, but in quiet corners of his life, far from the cameras. In the early days of his career, when fame was still something distant, Keanu met a young actor named River Phoenix. They were both dreamers, both outsiders in an industry that devoured and discarded people without a thought. They would sit for hours after long days on set, talking about the meaning of art, about music and poetry, about how to stay whole in a world that asked you to wear masks. River, with his restless energy and sharp wit, felt like a brother, a soul that understood Keanu without needing translation. They planned future projects together, dreamed of starting bands, even spoke of buying a quiet piece of land far from the chaos where they could simply exist as themselves. Then, one night, that future was ripped away. River died suddenly. A bright flame extinguished in a moment. When the call came, Keanu was in the middle of work. He finished his scenes with a professionalism everyone admired him for, but something in his eyes changed. Those close to him said his silences grew longer, his smiles softer, his gaze more distant. River's loss became a shadow that never left, a reminder that life could pivot into tragedy without warning. Yet Keanu kept moving forward, carrying the weight in private, never asking for the world's sympathy. Years later, just as life seemed to offer him a new chapter, he met Jennifer Syme. She was not part of the noisy Hollywood crowd. She was calm, thoughtful, and saw through the glittering facade to the man behind it. With her, Keanu found a rare kind of peace. Their love was not loud or theatrical. It was quiet, built on shared dinners, whispered conversations, and a deep sense of understanding. They would drive through the city late at night with no destination, windows down, music filling the spaces between their words. For the first time in a long while, He imagined a future that felt real and warm and attainable. When Jennifer told him she was pregnant, Keanu's world expanded with hope. They began to talk about names. They imagined their daughter's laugh, the way she would grip his finger with her tiny hand, the soft weight of her asleep on his chest. Keanu, who rarely allowed himself to dream too far ahead, began sketching futures in his mind. He even paused his usual relentless work schedule to be there, to prepare, to be ready. He bought toys, painted walls, and kept a small ultrasound photo in his wallet like a treasure. But sometimes life deals blows so cruel they feel almost unreal. Their daughter Ava was stillborn. There was no cry in the delivery room, no small heartbeat to greet, just silence. Jennifer wept into Keanu's arms, and he held her, though his own heart felt like it had shattered into pieces too sharp to ever hold again. Friends said he walked for hours that night, long after visiting hours ended, wandering aimlessly under the streetlights, searching for answers that the universe refused to give. Grief became their shadow. They tried to heal, tried to carry on, but some wounds bleed inward for years. Jennifer struggled, her own pain consuming her in ways even Keanu could not reach. Months later, tragedy struck again. A car accident took her life on a quiet morning in Los Angeles. Just like that, the woman he loved, the woman who had shared his dreams, was gone. Keanu stood at her funeral, a solitary figure in a dark suit. His head bowed. Cameras were kept away, but those who were there spoke of the quiet devastation in his eyes, the way he stood like a man carrying the weight of worlds. He did not rage against fate. He did not demand headlines or attention. Instead, he retreated into work, throwing himself into films not as an escape but as a way to keep moving forward. Co-stars often spoke later about his kindness on set, the way he took time to thank every crew member, how he would slip checks to those in need without ever mentioning it again. Few realized these gestures came from a heart that knew loss so intimately that kindness had become his only rebellion against it. So when that viral photograph was taken, when the world zoomed in on a man sitting alone on a bench with a coffee cup, it was easy to make jokes. Easy to label him as sad Keanu without understanding. But the truth was deeper. That stillness was not emptiness. It was the quiet of someone who had walked through fires and somehow emerged still willing to offer warmth to others. His eyes were not sad because of fame or wealth or some shallow celebrity fatigue. They were the eyes of someone who had buried his best friend, his child and his partner, and yet refused to let bitterness take root. That day in the park, when the breeze toyed with his hair and the sounds of life moved around him, Keanu was not posing or performing. He was remembering. Perhaps he was thinking of River's laugh or Jennifer's smile, or the weight of the tiny life he never got to hold. Perhaps he was thinking of the way grief does not fade but becomes a quieter companion, always there, always reminding. Perhaps he was simply breathing, letting the world slow down enough for him to feel it all without distraction. And yet, despite that grief, despite the losses that shaped him, Keanu continued to live with an open heart. That is the part the memes and headlines never captured. He did not sit on that bench bitter or broken. He sat there as someone who had learned through pain what it means to be human, what it means to endure and still choose to be kind. The world saw a photograph. They saw a man alone. But behind those still eyes was a story of love, loss, and resilience. A story that explained why Keanu Reeves would quietly change a stranger's life moments later. The park bench was just the setting. The real weight of that day rested in the life that led him there. A life marked by tragedy, yes, but also by an extraordinary gentleness that few ever truly understood. The park's rhythm shifted as the days stretched on. The fountain's gentle trickle mixed with the laughter of a group of children chasing a red ball that kept rolling into the flower beds. The light changed, losing its harsh midday brightness, softening into something warmer, richer. Joggers began to thin out, replaced by couples strolling hand in hand, and the occasional busker setting up near the park entrance. Amid all this movement, Keanu remained on that weathered bench, his posture unchanged, his coffee cup still cradled gently in both hands. A young man moved along the path, his pace uneven, as though his thoughts weighed more than his steps could carry. He looked to be in his early 20s, though the slump in his shoulders made him seem older. His hoodie was fraying at the cuffs, the color washed out from too many cycles through a laundromat machine. His backpack hung heavily on one shoulder, the zipper crooked, a strap patched clumsily with black tape. He had come to the park not for leisure but for escape. The noise of the city, the relentless hum of traffic, the chatter of people who seemed to have somewhere to be, had pressed in on him all day, and he needed air that was not thick with expectation. When his eyes landed on the man sitting alone on the bench, he slowed. Recognition was not immediate. The man looked so ordinary, sitting there in a black jacket, his hair unstyled, boots dusty from walking, but there was something in his face that tugged at memory. The young man squinted, his breath catching for a second. No, it couldn't be, could it? He glanced around, half expecting to see cameras or a security detail, but there were none. Just people walking dogs, a mother with a stroller, a skateboarder practicing lazy tricks. His heart began to thud as he stepped closer, fighting a strange mix of awe and hesitation. Keanu Reeves, if it really was him, had been a fixture in his life, not personally, but through screens. He had watched The Matrix late at night when everything else in life felt out of reach. He had replayed John Wick during nights when insomnia clawed at him, and now, here this man was, in the flesh, sitting on a bench like anyone else. The young man slowed, unsure if he should speak, unsure if interrupting would shatter the quiet that seemed to surround the figure like a fragile bubble. For a long moment he stood there, hands stuffed into the front pocket of his hoodie, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Keanu, sensing presence, lifted his eyes slightly but said nothing. The young man swallowed hard. His voice, when it finally came, was soft, uncertain. "Excuse me, are you?" He trailed off, suddenly aware of how foolish it might sound. Keanu's gaze met his, calm and direct, and for a heartbeat the young man felt completely seen. There was no trace of annoyance or arrogance in those eyes, only quiet curiosity. A small, gentle smile touched Keanu's lips. "Yes," he said, voice low, unforced. "But today, I'm just sitting." The answer disarmed him. The young man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I thought you might be," he admitted awkwardly. His eyes darted to the empty stretch of bench beside Keanu. "Is it okay if I sit?" Keanu gave a small nod. "Sure." He lowered himself onto the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful gap between them. For a while neither spoke. The sounds of the park filled the silence. The faint splashing of the fountain, the breeze stirring through branches, the rhythmic whir of a passing cyclist's wheel. The young man stared at his shoes, tracing the scuffs on the toes, the way the laces had frayed. He wanted to say something but didn't know how to begin. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "Rough day." The question was simple, almost clumsy, but it carried a vulnerability that surprised even him. Keanu turned his head slightly, his dark eyes resting on the young man. He seemed to consider the question for a moment before answering, his voice soft. "Some days are heavier than others." The young man gave a short, humorless laugh, nodding. "Yeah, I know that feeling." He hesitated, biting the inside of his cheek. He hadn't meant to say more, but the words came spilling out, unplanned. "I lost my job last week," he confessed, voice low, "and my dad's been sick. I don't even know how I'm gonna help him. Feels like everything's falling apart." The admission hung in the air like a fragile glass ornament. Keanu didn't interrupt. He didn't glance away. He simply listened, his body language open, his attention complete. The young man kept talking, halting at first, then with growing ease as the silence between them became safe. He spoke of nights spent awake in worry, of bills piling up, of a sister who lived too far away to help. He spoke of feeling invisible, like the city was a machine that would keep turning whether he survived or not. Keanu's face remained calm, but his eyes softened, dark pools reflecting a deep well of empathy. The young man realized in some distant part of his mind that he hadn't spoken this honestly to anyone in months, and here he was, pouring his heart out to a stranger who happened to be a man he'd only ever seen on a screen. "You know," Keanu said quietly after a long pause, "sometimes it helps just to say it out loud, even if nothing changes right away." The young man nodded, his throat tight. "It's been hard," he admitted. Keanu leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, mirroring the young man's posture. "You're carrying a lot," he said, "but you're still here. That says something." The young man felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, but quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of his hoodie. "You must think I'm crazy," he said, trying to laugh. Keanu shook his head, a faint smile returning. "No, I think you're human." There was a long silence then, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that heals, that lets words sink in and find their place. Around them, the park carried on. Children laughing, birds chirping, distant conversations rising and falling like waves. But for the young man and the figure beside him, the world had shrunk to that bench, that moment, that shared humanity. And so they sat, two strangers in the fading light, joined not by fame or expectation, but by something far deeper. The simple act of being present with each other. The conversation between the young man and Keanu faded into a gentle stillness. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor across the park. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a bright, cheerful sound that seemed to cut through the heavy silence of their thoughts. The young man exhaled slowly, running his thumb along the frayed seam of his hoodie pocket. He had said more to this stranger in the past 15 minutes than he had said to anyone in months. Keanu leaned back slightly, his eyes still on the young man. His expression was thoughtful, not searching for words to fill the silence, but simply allowing the moment to be. There was no rush in him, no need to move on quickly. For someone so well known, he carried none of the impatience that fame often breeds. Instead, he seemed to live in the rhythm of people's stories, listening without judgment. "It's been hard," the young man said again, voice quiet now, almost as if speaking to himself. "I keep thinking, maybe I'm supposed to figure this all out on my own, but I can't." Keanu nodded slowly, letting those words sit between them. "No one should have to carry everything alone," he said softly. His voice was low and calm, as if he had spoken those words to himself many times before. He reached into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing against something tucked away there. The young man watched as Keanu pulled out a small notepad. Its edges were curled, and the cardboard backing had softened from being carried around too long. Flipping through the pages, Keanu stopped at a blank sheet and pulled a pen from his pocket. The pen clicked softly in the air between them, a tiny, ordinary sound that suddenly felt charged with meaning. He began to write, his handwriting neat and deliberate, the ink moving smoothly across the page. The young man tilted his head, curious. "What are you?" he began, but Keanu lifted his hand gently, not to shush him but to say, "Wait a second." When he finished, he folded the paper once, then twice, creasing it carefully with the edge of his thumb. He held it out, his eyes meeting the young man's with quiet gravity. "Here," Keanu said. His tone was simple, but there was something in the way he offered the note that made it feel heavier than just paper. The young man unfolded it, eyes scanning the handwriting. Name, phone number. Beneath that, a line written in the same calm, measured script. "Tell them Keanu sent you." His brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. What is this?" Keanu shifted slightly, his voice low and steady. "It's a foundation I work with sometimes. They help people. Medical costs, support, things like that. Call them. Tell them what you told me. They helped someone I care about once." The young man's lips parted, but no words came out. He stared down at the note, feeling the texture of the paper between his fingers, the faint indentation of the pen strokes. For a moment, all he could do was hold it, as though it might vanish if he blinked. "You don't have to," he began, but Keanu shook his head. his smile small and genuine. "I want to," he said. "You said your dad's sick. Maybe they can help." Tears stung the young man's eyes before he could stop them. He turned his face slightly, rubbing at them with the back of his hand, embarrassed. I don't even know how to thank you," he whispered. His voice trembled, and he hated how small he felt, how vulnerable. "You don't have to," Keanu said, his tone carrying a softness that made the words feel like a blanket draped over shoulders too cold for too long. "Take care of your family. That's enough." They sat there for a moment longer, the note still in the young man's hands. The sun slipped lower, the light thickening into gold, stretching long shadows across the path. The laughter of children began to fade as parents gathered their things to head home. The distant hum of traffic grew louder, signaling the city beyond the park waking up for the evening rush. Keanu stood, brushing at the dust on his jeans with slow, methodical movements. The young man looked up, feeling a pang of panic. He didn't want this moment to end, didn't want this stranger who felt like a lifeline to disappear back into the anonymity of the city. "Wait," he said quickly. "Why are you doing this?" Keanu paused, looking down at him. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with that same quiet honesty that had carried through every word, he replied, "Because someone once did it for me." There was nothing more to say. Keanu gave a small nod, slipped his hands into the pockets of his jacket, and turned toward the path. The young man watched as he walked away, blending effortlessly into the flow of people heading toward the park exit. No one else seemed to notice him. No cameras followed. No one pointed or stared. The young man looked down at the note again, his hands trembling slightly. He folded it carefully, almost reverently, and tucked it into the pocket of his hoodie. He sat there long after Keanu had gone, staring at the empty space on the bench, feeling the strange warmth of hope bloom inside him for the first time in what felt like years. In the days to come, no headlines would write about this moment. No viral posts would recount the details. The world would continue laughing at the photograph, spinning stories about sad Keanu, never knowing that, moments after that picture was taken, he had changed a stranger's life in the most unassuming way. And that was the beauty of it. True kindness does not wait for applause. It happens quietly, in the spaces no one else sees. On that bench, under the fading light, Keanu Reeves had offered more than just a phone number. He had offered proof that there are still people in the world willing to reach into someone's darkness and hand them a thread of light. The young man eventually stood, slipping his backpack onto his shoulder. As he walked out of the park, he felt a little taller, his steps a little steadier. In his pocket, the folded note pressed against his leg, a small, tangible promise that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The photograph continued to spread while the park slowly emptied and the day gave way to evening. A single moment frozen in time, a man in a black jacket hunched over a paper cup, became a canvas for strangers to project their assumptions. By the time streetlights flickered on, the image had already traveled across continents. It appeared on news sites, entertainment blogs, Twitter feeds, and Instagram stories. Some viewers paused and felt a pang of empathy. Many more laughed. Memes flooded timelines. When the pizza arrives and you realize you have no friends to share it with. When Neo finally understands the Matrix was just bills and bad coffee. The humor was relentless, clever, but also detached, crafted by people who had no idea what they were really looking at. The young man who had sat beside Keanu watched the online chaos with disbelief when he got home. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, friends sending him links. "Hey, isn't this your city? Look at Keanu Reeves. What a mood, right?" He stared at the image of the man who had handed him a folded note just hours ago. He wanted to type out what had really happened, that Keanu Reeves had listened to him like no one else had, that he had given him more hope in 10 minutes than he had felt in years. But he hesitated. Would anyone believe him? Would they think he was chasing attention? He closed the apps and sat on his bed in silence, the note still in his hoodie pocket like a secret too precious to share. Across the city, life moved on. Keanu, unaware or perhaps unconcerned about the viral frenzy, went about his evening quietly. He stopped by a small cafe, greeting the barista by name. He left a tip in the jar without ceremony, accepted his tea with a smile, and sat at a corner table to sip in peace. People recognized him occasionally, but his presence never demanded attention. That was the paradox of Keanu Reeves. He could command a screen with his presence, yet in real life he moved like water, slipping through crowds unnoticed, leaving ripples of kindness wherever he passed. Meanwhile, the internet spun its own story. Comment sections argued, "Why does he look so sad? He has everything." Others replied, "Money doesn't heal grief." A few fans began sharing snippets of his history. How he had lost his best friend River Phoenix, how he had lost his daughter before she could take her first breath, how he had buried the woman he loved months later. These comments were often drowned out by the louder, flashier memes. People are quick to laugh, slower to listen. But those who had been touched by Keanu's kindness in some small way saw the photo differently. A crew member from one of his films posted quietly, "This man gave me part of his paycheck when my wife got sick. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't ask for anything in return." A stunt coordinator commented, "He took us all out to dinner every week of shooting. He said the crew makes the movie, not the actor." Slowly, a different narrative began to surface, like pieces of a puzzle forming a larger picture. People started to see beyond the meme and into the humanity of the man on the bench. Back in the park, that very bench remained, just a worn piece of wood and metal surrounded by fallen leaves. No one sitting there now would know the story it had witnessed, that two strangers sat side by side, one quietly changing the life of the other. The world would never know that Keanu had folded a piece of paper with a number that could save someone's father. That kind of act doesn't trend. It doesn't fit neatly into a caption or a 10-second video, but it is the kind of act that plants seeds in people's hearts, seeds that bloom long after the cameras are gone. A week later, the young man stood in his small apartment, the folded note in his hand. He had stared at it for days, his thumb tracing the ink, reading the words over and over. "Tell them Keanu sent you." He finally dialed the number. The voice on the other end was warm, professional, patient as he stumbled through his explanation. Days later, paperwork arrived. Assistance was arranged. His father's medication, once out of reach, became manageable. For the first time in months, the weight on his chest lifted just enough for him to take a full, deep breath. He thought often of going back to the park to thank Keanu, but the man was never there. He asked around at the cafe nearby, and the barista smiled knowingly, as if to say, "He comes and goes, always quiet, always kind." The young man realized that maybe it wasn't about finding him again. Maybe it was about what you do with a kindness once you've received it. He began volunteering at a local shelter on weekends, quietly passing on the same kind of listening ear Keanu had offered him. As the months passed, the photograph's virality faded. New memes took its place. New headlines pushed it down the endless scroll of the internet. But for those who had been changed by the man in that photograph, it never faded. To them, it was a reminder. You never know the battle someone is fighting, even if they seem to have the world. You never know the weight behind someone's stillness. And sometimes, the person sitting quietly on a park bench is carrying more history, more loss, and more generosity than you could ever imagine. For Keanu, there was no need to explain, no desire to correct the narrative. He had learned long ago that acts of kindness lose nothing by remaining unseen. In interviews, he sometimes smiled when asked about the meme. "I was just eating a sandwich," he once said with a small chuckle. The audience laughed, but those who looked closely saw something in his eyes, a depth that spoke of stories untold. He would go on to make more films, ride more subways, give up more seats to strangers. He would continue to live in a way that quietly defied the cruelty he had endured. That bench in the park would remain, weathering sun and rain, waiting for the next person who needed a moment of stillness. And somewhere Keanu would be walking, maybe in another park, maybe on another quiet street, ready without announcement or fanfare to listen, to help, to remind someone that even in a world so quick to laugh, there are still hearts willing to sit with you in your pain. Weeks passed, and the internet's attention moved on, as it always does. New jokes, new headlines, new fleeting obsessions filled the feeds. But in the quiet corners of real life, far from the scrolling and swiping, the echo of that one encounter continued to grow. The young man who had received the folded note began to see his world differently. The foundation Keanu had connected him with provided guidance and support, easing his father's medical costs. A burden that had once felt immovable began to shift. He could breathe again. He could plan again. And as he watched his father smile for the first time in weeks, he thought back to that bench, to that quiet man who had simply listened and then acted without expecting anything in return. Keanu, meanwhile, continued to walk the path he had always chosen, a path of understated presence, on a crowded subway. He remained standing so an elderly woman could sit, his hands resting lightly on the railing as the train jolted forward. In a cafe, he stopped to speak with a cashier about her day, not out of politeness but out of genuine interest, leaving behind a larger tip than she would ever expect. On a film set, he shared lunch with the crew instead of isolating himself in a private trailer, asking them about their families, remembering their names, making sure everyone felt seen. These moments never trended. They rarely even reached the public eye, but they built a legacy more enduring than any viral meme. When people spoke of him, those who had met him in these quiet ways often carried the same tone. Soft, reverent, almost disbelieving. A lighting technician once said, "He helped me carry cables after a long day. I thought, this guy is a superstar, and he's helping me like we're equals." A driver recounted how Keanu noticed him shivering one night on set and gave him his own jacket without hesitation. These were not grand gestures meant for headlines. They were small acts, but they added up to something greater. A life lived with a humility that few in his position ever master. Back in the young man's small apartment, he pinned the folded note to a corkboard above his desk. It became a talisman, a reminder that kindness is not just something you receive, it is something you carry forward. He began volunteering at a local shelter every weekend. At first, he simply handed out meals, but soon he found himself listening, really listening, to the stories of people who felt invisible. He realized that he could offer the same gift Keanu had offered him: presence, empathy, a lifeline in the form of undivided attention. Months later, as autumn returned to the city, the park was once again awash with color. Golden leaves blanketed the gravel paths, and the air carried the earthy scent of change. The young man returned to that bench, now with his father slowly walking beside him, leaning on a cane. They sat together in the fading light, and the young man recounted the story of the day his life had shifted. His father listened quietly, his eyes bright with unshed tears, squeezing his son's hand. "There are still good people in this world," his father said softly, "and now so are you." Keanu himself never spoke publicly about that day on the bench. When asked about the meme years later in an interview, he chuckled and said, "I was just eating a sandwich." The audience laughed, but those who understood saw the faint trace of something deeper in his eyes. That day was never about a sandwich. It was about a man choosing, in the midst of his own private pain, to help someone else. It was about how the quietest moments can ripple outward in ways we may never see. And so the photograph faded from headlines, but the legacy it hinted at grew stronger. In a world obsessed with noise and spectacle, Keanu Reeves reminded people that heroism is often silent. It's in the seat you give up on the train. It's in the money you quietly donate to a struggling family. It's in the way you listen to a stranger as if they are the only person in the world. It's in the folded note you press into someone's hand with no expectation of thanks. Even years later, when people stumbled across the image online, some still laughed, but others paused. They thought of the stories that had emerged, the whispered accounts of kindness behind the scenes. They thought of how easy it is to judge a moment without understanding the history behind it. And maybe, just maybe, they thought of how they themselves could sit a little longer, listen a little deeper, give a little more. Keanu never sought to be a symbol. He never wanted to be anything but himself. A man doing what he could, where he could, with what he had. Yet in living that way, he became something more than any headline could capture. He became proof that compassion survives, even in a world that often seems determined to forget it. And somewhere right now, he might be walking through another park, sipping another coffee, ready once again to offer someone a kindness they will never forget. As the evening settled over the city and street lamps flickered to life, the park bench stood empty. Leaves tumbled across its worn wooden slats, whispering secrets to no one in particular. But if you sat there long enough, you might feel it. The lingering presence of a moment when a man known to the world simply chose to be human, to listen, to help, and to remind us all that quiet strength can change everything.